So it's my great pleasure to introduce Venugopal Maddipati, who is an architectural historian teaching here in Delhi at the School of Design at Ambedkar University. He graduated in 2001 from the School of Planning and Architecture in Delhi and did his MA and PhD in art history from the University of Minnesota. And we couldn't, was it Rick or Kathy, your main advisor? Kathy, okay, so Kathy is his main advisor, but as with all of us who come out of Minnesota, basically it's a joint project, the mentoring. He is the author of Gandhi in Architecture, A Time for Low-Cost Housing, which came out from Routledge in 2021, and I highly recommend, and is the co-editor of The Materiality of Liquescence, which was co-edited with Shugata Roy from Routledge in 2019. In 2017, he gave a seminar on the architecture of ecological silence in Berlin, and he is currently writing a book on necessity and mimesis in a time of climate-related crises in South Asia. He's been a core faculty in the program at Ambedkar, program on social design at Ambedkar University since 2013. There he teaches courses on the social contract, intersectionality, shelter, and design. He also teaches courses in art history. His talk today is titled Beyond Architecture as Evidence, Gandhi and the Sacrifice of Self-Sacrifice. All right.
So I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to speak, and I think I'd prepared some sort of an introduction on why this conference on Rick and what my paper would probably contribute. But then I was kind of thinking on the way, I've just managed to put this together in the past 1 month, slicing out bits of time from here and there. And I think it's, I was going to say that Rick was this extraordinary person who could synthesize bits and pieces. So I think until the moment I got here, I'm just like weaving things together. And I'd just say that I'd start by saying that I'm so much in awe of him for being able to do this, like in terms of personal relationships, in terms of professional relationships, in terms of getting things together, right? And I keep scrambling, so I'll just say that. So I'll start. So it's really, also I think the title's shifted a little bit because of the slicing, but it's broadly in the same direction. And secondly, it's again this idea of synthesizing very diverse strands of information and writing which have spanned a considerable period of time, including my time as a PhD student under Kathy Asher in Minnesota, and also, of course, more recent materials. So perhaps if you've had the opportunity of reading any of this content or hearing it, there's bits and pieces sort of peeping in here from other times, but it's an attempt at trying to bring them together, and perhaps successfully or unsuccessfully, even I'm not very sure. So actually, this is the first time I'm actually trying to weave together a number of strands. So I'll start. So I'll say, rarely has the Indian political leader and revolutionary Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi's legacy been as imperiled as it is in the present. There are simply too many denunciations of Gandhi to ignore. So if it isn't an appeal to replace his image on India's paper currency, it is the toppling of his statues globally on account of his racism that makes headlines. However central Gandhi may have been to a political imagination of India's freedom struggle and non-violence in the past, his tenability as a social icon is weakening today. But what if Gandhiism was constitutively weak to begin with? What if one were to trace the provenance of Gandhi's enfeebling not so much to the present conjuncture, but to the past? Gandhiism as a weak, decentered force, it could be argued, has been with us all along. Scholarship only hasn't adequately reckoned with it. Consider Satyagraha. The insistence on truth, or Satyagraha, was, by Gandhi's own account, akin to the art of decentering history. So Satyagraha's remit lay beyond historical time, that is, beyond the time of conspicuously noticeable events. Gandhi's remarks on the time of Satyagraha, and I'm just trying to emphasize this idea of the time of Satyagraha and history, in his revolutionary pamphlet Hind Swaraj, are revealing. I'm going to read out this excerpt. Many of you might be familiar with it. The force of love or satyagraha is the same as the force of the soul or truth. We have evidence of its working at every step. The universe would disappear without the existence of that force. But you ask for historical evidence. It is therefore necessary to know what history means, right? And so the Gujarati equivalent means it so happened. If that is the meaning of history, it is possible to give copious evidence. But if history means the doings of kings and emperors, there can be no evidence of soul force or passive resistance or satyagraha in such history. You cannot expect silver ore in a tin mine, right? So a very famous portion of Hind Swaraj. So just to sort of reiterate, history pays Hind Swaraj assumes centrality in public discourse because it privileges the actions of kings and emperors, right? And because history privileges the actions of kings and emperors, satyagraha or the force of truth does not register in historical consciousness. And so, rather, it implies a steady disengagement from the fervor of evidence-based history. Satyagraha is a force that enjoins upon its adherents to pull away from that which seems historically significant or memorable into the weaker, less breathtaking experience of everydayness, or more specifically into the experience of householding and neighborliness. And so there's this paradox over here that today Gandhi stands discredited precisely on account of his inadequacies as a householder and as a neighbor. In other words, today in the 21st century, the pursuit of satyagraha or an account of ordinariness unexpectedly results in the weakening of the more tenaciously held impressions of 20th century Gandhian history. So consider the most recent conversations related to Gandhi's stay in South Africa. In her 2014, again, sorry, I don't forgot the dates right, Gandhi's printing press, the African studies scholar Isabel Hofmeyr, for instance, draws attention to the turn of the century Phoenix in South Africa as an ideological hinterland where Gandhi's printing press was neighbors with the Olanje Institute established by John Langali Balele Dube in July 1901. So notwithstanding the similarities, and so this is actually just an impression of Dube, and this is an image from the Olanje school, which he sets up, inspired, it seems, from the Tuskegee experiment in the US. And so notwithstanding, so it's right next to the Olanje Institute that you actually have this this printing press of the Phoenix Ashram, right? So and so the founding motto actually at the Olanje Institute is to teach the hand to work, the brain to understand, and the heart to serve, right? And so it's somewhat similar to what you actually see in Phoenix, in the Phoenix Ashram. But notwithstanding this similarity, these two remarkable communities kept their distance and met rarely, according to Isabel Hofmeyr, right? So it's just not the case that they actually meet each other. So Gandhi's distance from his more immediate neighbor at Phoenix should not come as a surprise to those who followed Gandhiana for any length of time. Already in 1886, in his green pamphlet, Gandhi had objected to the classing of Indians with natives of South Africa, or what he called the Kafir races. One learns much in this regard from Ashwin Desai and Ghulam Wahid's 2016, The South African Gandhi, Stretcher Bearer of Empire. So against the grain of more mainstream narratives that anoint Gandhi as a fierce upholder of the rights of indentured Indians in South Africa, Wahid and Desai draw attention to Gandhi's entrenchment within then prevailing everyday racialized prejudicial attitudes, stemming as these attitudes did from the divergent forms of rent levied upon Africans and Indians in the region. So there's a whole discourse on rent. So it is for editing out in later years his early involvement in this everyday racism against the Zulus in particular, while leading campaigns against the Asiatic ordinances in the Transvaal then, that Desai and Wahid hold Gandhi accountable. So there's something to be said then about drawing attention not so much to Gandhi's interest in decentering history in Hind Swaraj, not so much to his idea of satyagraha, but rather to the manner in which he centered his own sense of history. in the story of my experiments with truth, and of course, Satyagraha in South Africa, the kind of texts that come out in 1927 and 28 respectively, right? And other significant documents related to his past personal conduct, right? So such a critical reversal, I mean to say that like if you're going from Satyagraha, which is talking about everydayness, and you actually reverse that and show how he's making himself into a historical figure by actually undermining this everydayness that he's actually engaged in. So this reversal of Gandhi's own sense of history brings us into the presence of an entire array of discredited, marginalized, and weak relationships and objects and spaces whose very marginality and weakness was constitutive of the centrality of Gandhi's impressions of himself, right? So I kind of try to reverse this way in which we approach this. So take the case of Gandhian architecture. Now, there's a substantial corpus related to Gandhi, whether in South Africa, where he established the Phoenix Ashram in 1904, and the Tolstoy farm in 1910, or later in India, where he established the Satyagraha Ashram in Ahmedabad, and the Sevagram Ashram in Wardha, right? So it's entirely conceivable that Gandhi dovetailed the travails of householding in these locations with his conceptions of transformative social and political change, right? I mean, that's the dominant narrative. In terms of restoration discourse, we somehow see these spaces as being central to Gandhi's legacy. So in other words, household space mattered for Gandhi, right? So that's a dominant impression. There is, however, a paradox. Any attempt at emphasizing the centrality of household architectural imagery to Gandhi's political and social journey is, in some respects, fundamentally incompatible with those segments of the Gandhi archive devoted to his body and to health. And so the portions of his writing dating to the 1930s and early 40s, for instance, had their own story to tell. Architecture, it would appear, was a weakened, attenuated phenomenon in Gandhi's imagination. He was apt to pull away from it in the favor of foregrounding and centralizing his more pressing centralized concerns about his body and public openness, right? So this weakness of architecture is nowhere more palpably in evidence than his so I was just going to actually show you some images of his body. So this weakness of architecture is nowhere more palpably in evidence than in his 1942 essay titled Akash or Sky. And Akash was a part of a larger volume titled Key to Health. And so there's also the Hindi translation that Gandhi wrote while he was imprisoned in the Aga Khan Palace following the launch of the Quit India movement. So here's some images of the Aga Khan Palace. So already a decade earlier, in 1932, before the Quit India movement, Gandhi had written about Akash to his nephew Narandas while he was imprisoned in the Yeravada jail. So he wrote in this letter, he reminisced in that letter, "I was filled with sudden enthusiasm during the last month of my stay in jail. Why should I not give time to watch that Akash, which to the outward eye instantaneously reveals the presence of God?" So taken in was Gandhi by Akash that he could not turn himself from staring at it at night, right? Staring towards it at night, or staring at it at night. So he gazed at the sky because he wished to quench what he says is the thirst which was awakened within me for a knowledge of the heavens, right? And that's roughly how he's phrasing it. So if Gandhi returned then to contemplating Akash in 1942, that's about a decade later, he did so because he, by his own admission, once again had the time to do so. So again, he's in prison, so he's clearly having a lot of time. So as he mentioned in his introduction to Key to Health, so this is just a sort of an excerpt from the text, but I'll just come to that in a second. The present enforced rest offers me such an opportunity and I'm taking advantage of it. So more pertinently, Gandhi confided in his introduction to Key to Health that anyone who observes the rules of health mentioned in this book will find that he, it's a him, has got in it a real key to unlock the gates leading him to health. He will not need to knock at the doors of doctors or vaidyas from day to day, right? So at the very least then, when Gandhi wrote about the sky at the Aga Khan Palace in 1942, he wrote about it because he was concerned about the bodily health of his followers, right? I mean, it's clearly a text about health, right? So the freeing up of the body from its vestments led, as Gandhi observed in Akash, to the enjoyment of the maximum amount of health. So I'll just quickly read out some parts of this. So on a clear day, this is an excerpt from Akash. On a clear day, on looking up, one sees a beautiful mauve blue canopy, which is known as Akash or sky. So far as we are concerned, the sky or the ether is limitless. And the first lesson to be learned in this is that we should not put any partitions between ourselves and the sky, the infinite, which is very near and yet very far. So if our bodies could be in contact with the sky without the interventions of houses, roofs, and even clothes, we are likely to enjoy the maximum amount of health. So to the extent that we are able to approach that state in practice, we will enjoy contentment and peace of mind. Many households are so packed with all sorts of unnecessary decorations and furniture, which one can very well do without, that a simple living man, again, male, will feel suffocated in those surroundings. They are nothing but means of harboring dust, bacteria, and insects. So here is the house where I'm under detention. Here in the house where I'm under detention, I feel quite lost. The heavy furniture, chairs, tables, sofas, bedsteads, innumerable looking glasses all get on my nerves. My desire to be in tune with the infinite has saved me from many complications in life. In a nutshell, and in the language of the subject under discussion, I have gone on creating more and more contact with Akash. With the increase in the contact went improvement in health. I've had more contentment and peace of mind, and the desire for belongings almost disappeared, etc. Right? So the freeing up of the body from its vestment led, as Gandhi observed, to the enjoyment of the maximum amount of health. So if on the one hand, an increase in material possessions such as heavy furniture, chairs, tables, sofas, bedsteads, and innumerable looking glasses engendered feelings of suffocation, on the other hand, decreasing material possessions and becoming more exposed to the element Akash saved one from the complications of life. In other words, the more one increases contact between oneself and this ethereal nothingness called Akash, the more peaceful one becomes in a bodily sense. And yet, notwithstanding such an immediate interpretation of Akash as a text devoted to an ethereal nothingness and the bodily peace that comes with an exposure to it, weaker thoughts arise at a second remove in subsequent readings of this text. Going beyond merely engaging with the diminution of architecture and clothes as a means towards establishing the existence of an ether that was nothing at all, one also begins to sort of dimly discern how in Akash the relegation of clothes and architecture into the background may have also served to somehow mark or inaugurate the body as a more immediate, relevant foreground, right? So Gandhi's body, one could argue, did not so much precede the retrenchment of architecture and clothes in his imagination. Rather, it was a very act of explicitly diminishing or decentering the value of architecture and clothes that raises the curtain in the first instance on the body as a center or as a site of Gandhian healthful practice. So such a weak second reading of Akash is certainly of a piece with a larger arc of Gandhi's political attempts at enhancing the visibility of his own body. In this regard, one could turn towards the anthropologist Joseph Walter's now classic Gandhi's Body, Sex, Diet, and the Politics of Nationalism to learn more about Gandhi's attempts at conspicuously emplacing his own bodies with its proclivities and desires at the hub of his efforts at bringing about social and political change in late imperial India. As Alter observes, while working towards reform on a national scale, Gandhi often delineated the problem of action in terms of a discrete microphysics of self-discipline required of those involved, right? So even when writing about national and international events, he seems to have been preoccupied with himself, with his embodied subjectivity in the context of dramatic socio-political change. So rather than arriving at Gandhi from the vantages of his ideas, which could be divested of their material basis, one could, as Alter suggests, begin with the microphysics of self-discipline of Gandhi's incarnate material self. In other words, one could begin with Gandhi's emphasis on his own body as a material locus of struggles to make better sense of his Indian nationalist project. So what then, in the light of Alter's writing about Gandhi's body, are the prospects of writing histories of architecture as a weak, faintly discernible, decentered artifact in Gandhi's imagination? So should one explore the manner in which architecture itself may have emerged as a kind of a marginalized or negated phenomenon in Gandhi's imagination, or as a phenomenon that he forcefully relegated to the marginal spaces of domesticity and interiority in the favor of foregrounding his more pressing centralized concerns over his own public presence as a body, right? which is like, is this the protagonicity of the body that we're looking at, and like architecture being as this kind of backdrop? So what indeed are the prospects for writing architectural histories more broadly on a weak footing? How might one pursue critical architectural histories in which architecture's very protagonicity is in doubt? Can architecture be a marginal or negated site where the more well-established, stable, semantic and semiological systems and fixities of Gandhi's thinking weaken over time? Now, as disappointing as it might sound, an examination of the architecture of Gandhi's residences dating to the mid-1930s in the village of Shegaon in Wardha, in the Wardha district, brings one no closer to answering the aforementioned questions. Instead, an examination of those residences, which were built between 1936 and 1937, only serves to heighten one's sense of puzzlement. Those residences in Shegaon, known today as Adi Niwas and Bapukuti, have their own peculiar story to tell. So, Adi Niwas and Bapukuti were designed by Gandhi's follower, the British spiritualist Madeline Slade, who was also known as Miraben. And in July 1936, so I think just to give you a sense of who she was, a few images. So in July 1936, when the then hexagenarian Gandhi shifted to Shegaon to personally oversee constructive village improvement work, he initially stayed in Adi Niwas, right? And so the Gandhi archive dating to the time provides some evidence related to the construction of this structure. So Gandhi ordained that the construction of this hut was to not exceed rupees 100, right? So this is a letter that he sends to Jamnalal Bajaj. Moreover, he forsook the expense of having partitions made within his hut, even as he asserted his need for a bare, indispensable minimum dwelling, right? So in that sense, it's safe to say that the architecture of Adi Niwas was a parsimonious one, right? Now, and so this is obviously also not a plan which is partitioned. It's just one single space where everybody is sort of being together. Now, unlike the unpartitioned plan of Adi Niwas, the plan of Bapukuti was, as we shall see, a more elaborate one. So in 1936, when Gandhi's health deteriorated, Slade refashioned a nearby hut that she had built for herself to accommodate him. This second hut, Bapukuti, was, as Slade claimed in her autobiography, titled The Spirit's Pilgrimage, I highly recommend you read it. This was what she called a proper cottage for Bapu. So at a plinth area of roughly 80 square meters, this proper cottage was not particularly large. However, in spite of the relative meagerness of its size, one notes the generosity with which Slade had allocated functions inside its enclosed walls. So within the confines of Bapukuti's thick exterior mud walls, as essayed, so this is a 1954 plan, so this structure was built in Delhi, in what was Pragati Maidan, in a low-cost housing exhibition. To scale, it was built. And so this plan is actually a part of the exhibition souvenir booklet, which I've reconstructed with the help of LA Landscape Architecture Foundation. So what you can see is within the confines of Bapukuti's thick exterior mud walls, as essayed in this 1954 plan, one finds, among other functions, a veranda, a living room, a storeroom, a lavatory, and even a massage room. Moreover, the living room itself was divided into three portions with a central, I think we just point this out. So this is like three portions over here, right? So it's a very small space, but it's a diversity of functions, right? So it's divided into three portions with a central seating area for Gandhi, flanked by walls of two subsidiary spaces on either side. So this is actually that central space, right? If you actually see the portion in the middle where you see those numberings, so this is actually that space if you were to visit it today, although this is also an old photograph. So setting aside this elaborate architecture of Bapukuti for the time being, let us pay attention to Gandhi's own activities in Wardha dating to the late colonial period, right? So as it turns out, the Gandhi who stayed in Shegaon in the mid-1930s may not have been entirely unlike the person who wrote Akash nearly 7 years later in the Aga Khan Palace. So in this regard, in 2004, I interviewed two Gandhians in Wardha, Dr. Vibha Gupta and the late Thakurdas Bang. This is an image of Professor Bang. And they spoke about the outdoors. So he was actually staying in Shegaon at that time. So he's staying in one of those huts, and I was kind of pestering him for some answers, and I'll give you the answer that he gave me. So he sort of, they spoke about the outdoors. So while Dr. Gupta drew from what she'd heard from Gandhians since childhood to suggest that Gandhi was like a soldier who mostly lived outside his huts. So why are you even studying his huts? That's the general thing, right? So, and on the other hand, Professor Bang suggested gently that I should not be studying the interior architecture of his huts at all. Rather, I should be studying the whole of the environment outside the hut. So he literally made this gesture. You should be studying the whole, right? I mean, it's about holism. That's a whole different story, and I'll not get into that. But the point is, you're wasting your time just looking at this one small thing over here. So whatever else Bapu Kuti may have been in terms of its interior architectural arrangements, we must pay heed to the task of imagining it in the negative sense. That is, as a limited or finite place to be relinquished in the favor of an infinite Akash or a limitless universe, right? So it's the whole, right? Yeah. So insofar as one pays heed to Dr. Gupta and Professor Bang's narrations, one cannot entirely envisage Bapu Kuti independent of its relations to Gandhi's periodic withdrawals from it, right? In other words, you remove, and there's one way of looking at things, which also is contradicted by the archive later on. In one way of looking at things, remove the Gandhians' allusions to Gandhi's withdrawal from the architecture in Shegaon in the 1930s, and we are bereft of a legitimate Gandhian way of experiencing that very architecture, right? So, the very idea that they're saying don't spend time looking at it is actually a legitimate way of experiencing it, right? So, insofar as we attach importance to this train of thought, right? And yet, it is one thing to say that one can, in keeping with the accounts of Gandhians, at best study Bapu Kuti in a weaker or negative sense, that is, as a place to be left behind in the favor of a wider, more expansive Akash, right? So again, the protagonicity of Akash, right? It is or can be quite another thing to pay attention to Bapu Kuti as a self-abnegating or self-weakening form of architecture in its own right, right? So while in the former instance, and I'll try and explain what this means, while in the former instance one places emphasis on the redundancy, on its redundancy as a place to inhabit, right? Because he's leaving it behind, he's spending all his time outside. In fact, some of the photographs that I'm not sharing here are of him outside, right? So in the former instance, we're actually looking at it as a place that is redundant, right? It just exists because he's not spending time in it. In the latter instance, however, one studies the extent to which that building verges against the grain of its own materiality on becoming nothing at all. So the building itself is also trying to become like Akash, right? So, or more specifically, the building is attempting to dissipate itself into a wider, more expansive Akash. In other words, in the latter instance, one explores the extent to which an experience of the interiors of Bapu Kuti distantly approximates an experience of an outdoor Akash, right? So it's actually a place for health in itself, right? And there's enough for us to sort of think along those lines. That Bapu Kuti is no sealed, airtight volume is evident enough as one enters it in the daytime, right? And so the building has, just to show you a sense of what it is, like you have these sort of clear story openings, which run virtually uninterrupted along the higher reaches of its external walls, right? Now, while these unshuttered openings are protected from the harsh Vardha sun by the wide eaves of the hut, they also do allow a diffuse form of daylight to enter, right? As well as allowing air to circulate. Moreover, these unshuttered openings on the exterior faces of Bapu Kuti are only to be matched by the presence of wider openings above the interior walls of the structure that further draw in light and ventilation into the deeper reaches of the hut. So even in the interiors, light and air travels from above, right? So these unshuttered, clear-storied openings within Bapu Kuti are intriguing, not least because they have been recreated in buildings dating to a later time in Gandhi and Vardha, right? For instance, and this is just to give you a sense of what it looks like from the outside, right? That thing over there. In fact, if you see a Republic Day float in the 1950s, 54 if I'm not mistaken, you actually see those things being sort of paraded in Delhi. So these unshuttered clear story, okay, so just to give you a sense of another structure. So I was just saying that they're also happening elsewhere in other structures in Gandhi and Vardha. For instance, in Maganwadi, in the nearby city of Vardha, one can see that a hut belonging to Gandhi's follower, Joseph Kumarappa, has a band of clear story openings, right? This is to give you a sense of what it's like. But it's, of course, the gable end. So in Kumarappa's hut, which is constructed circa 1938, 2 years after Bapu Kuti, the high gable ends are virtually transformed into permeable screens, enabling air and light to travel freely into the structure, and so almost entirely negating the enclosed nature of the architecture at the lower level, right? So you just feel strange when you actually go to the space, because all of this is completely belied by what's happening above, right? Why would you need this if that's what you're going to do above, right? Which is actually the kind of interesting thing that you also see in Bapu Kuti. So, and similarly, if you actually go to the Magan Sangrahalaya, right, which is right next to Kumarappa's hut, that's Vinoba Bhave. So you actually see similar things happening about over there, right? So what then, in the light of such clear story openings, to make of the Gandhian architecture of Wardha? So as much as one feels obliged to chronicle the withdrawal of Gandhi's body from that architecture into the healthful plenitude of an outside Akash, one also at once feels compelled to narrate the ingress of tendrils of that very plenitude into the body of the self-same architecture, right? So like Akash is kind of creeping in as well. So while the very existence of Gandhi's sense of his own embodiment may have been predicated on his conspicuous withdrawal from the architecture of Wardha, insofar as you stay loyal to Akash, that text, right? It also bears saying that the existence of that very architecture as a Gandhian artifact may have been predicated on its capacity to become suffused with Akash, right? So these kinds of parallel observations come along as hanging out over here, right? So it also bears saying, so inasmuch as Gandhi believed in relinquishing his own dwelling circumstances so as to rouse or centralize his own corporeality in an open Akash, he may as well have continued to stay within the bounds of that architecture in Wardha that spontaneously verged on weakening itself and dissolving itself into a limitless Akash, right? So this is as far as you can go with one train of thought, right? But it's also not to say that we give up on this architecture completely just because it's weak, right? Just because it's actually being set aside and centralization is predicated on the marginalization of this. It's not the case that I'm saying that we should set aside this architecture. Partly also because Gandhi doesn't set it aside. Architecture evidently had a weaker purchase on healthful life than, say, open Akash. Weakness, however, is not an absence of something, right? It's the weakening of something. It's not the complete nullification of something. So I think, and that's very important to recognize, because Gandhi is the discourse at Sevagram is kind of contradictory, right? If you talk to the Gandhians, they're telling you that he's stepping out, right? But the discourse on Sevagram is about staying. It's about staying at great risk to oneself, because he actually develops malaria and he almost dies, right? But he insists on staying here, again, much to the chagrin of his followers and all the, they build a road for him just to get him to the hospital, and he insists on not going to the hospital. So he's a really stubborn old person at this time. But the point being that he is insisting on staying, right? So it's also the case that this is satyagraha, to the extent that it involves and entails staying with that which is ordinary, staying with householding and staying with neighborliness, right? To that extent, it is to sort of move away from this sort of central position of Congress leadership in the metropolis, right? So this is also the time when he actually gives up his leadership in the Congress. So you do see these kinds of contradictory strains. So on the one hand, there is a case to be made for this architecture, as this kind of weak and marginalized and decentered artifact. But on the other hand, it's also the case that he's actually exploring what it is to be engaged in that which is not centrality, that which is not historical, that which is everyday, that which is ordinary, right? So the social reproduction of labor, for instance, becomes a theme that resurfaces over here. When he's actually talking about the communities who are living around here, he talks about how they are not able to leave their place of work, and their workplace is right next to their house. So he's actually writing this letter to village workers. I'll end with this. He writes this letter to village workers, this village worker in Ahmedabad, and says that I do not like the fact that you leave your work of village work and go out on rounds. Because the villager, in his whatever that undifferentiated category, problematic as it is, in his mind is somebody who doesn't have the luxury of leaving, right? So it's not the case that they can actually leave their work and actually go back home and sort of be comfortable, right? Rather, the task of building the home, staying at home and working fold into each other, right? So which is where the social reproduction of labor, insofar as we want to use that phrase, is something that is a matter of concern for him, right? And so again, that's what I'm saying. So this time outside the time of the event, which is the time of public event, which is mostly a surplus time, which is not the kind of time that many people have, is not the kind of time that he's exploring in Sevagram. Rather, it's the work of everyday life, right? So therefore, what I'm saying is that you see these contradictory strains where he is invested in the weak, but he's also, like capable of sort of rendering it, like weak in itself, right, in terms of moving away from it. And I think that is roughly where I'm going, which is when we're actually talking about the weakening of Gandhism with all the critiques that we actually have of Gandhi for all of the problems that he presents. There is a weak presence that is not this centrality with which, the ousting of the king, right, is not what we necessarily are interested in, insofar as we stay loyal to this idea of weakness, right, and that there is a presence for Gandhism with all the problems that it presents. So I think that's the challenge in terms of owning up to, this question. So I think I'll stop it.
All right, so we have some time for questions for Venu. So would anyone like to?
Thank you. Yeah, hi. Thank you for this very rich and wonderful presentation. I'm Sarah. I'm a PhD candidate from Rutgers University. I'm so interested in these architectures that you showed us, and I was wondering if we can know anything about what Slade's models were for designing these spaces, and also if Gandhi was at all involved in the process.
Yeah.
Did he centralize his body as well in these architectures in some way? Like, did he decide where he was going to be placed somehow?
Yeah. So there's Slade writes that she's actually inspired by the Mahar community who lives nearby, and she actually sees the patterns that they make in their houses, and she imitates some of that. She writes about this. In terms of Gandhi's participation, he's corresponding with her. So he doesn't know what Adi Nivas looks like until he actually comes and sees it. He's just given the requirements like a client, like a good client. No more than 100 rupees should be spent. And, so he's being told that, look, if you want this thing with 100 rupees, then you will have to let go of the partitions, etc. He says that's fine. But it's not the case that he's actually coming and, taking a look at what's going on and participating. That's not what the archive seems to be saying. But yeah. I'll have other answers, yeah.
Sir, my question is actually regarding it's actually regarding post-independent national policy for architecture, which was developed around towards the end of 50s, if I'm not incorrect. So how do you think that your understanding of Gandhi and his requirement, his policy towards building and construction, and his understanding of space and body did continue or did seep into our national post-independent national architectural policy, or did not, and why do you think that is? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that to a large extent I've written about, but I think in a nutshell, it's interpreted differently at different points in time based upon the emerging policies. So it's a very different matter in 1950s India, where low-cost housing is a necessity in terms of the partition refugees coming in, right? So Gandhi actually here, where he's talking about leaving this hut, but this hut is built in Delhi just as the 5-year plan is being rolled out, as a virtuous example of what is good for welfare. So welfareism, the idea of welfare, which involves the family as a unit, right? So it's actually tied in with very specific notions of welfareism and the family, which always means a male householder, right? And gendered work, right? So this is an exemplary case where it's not the case that this is actually, in its construction, that was what was in the minds of people, but it's built over here as a part of many welfare models. In 1970s, for instance, a different matter. Gandhian architecture is tied in more with Charles Correa's idea of urbanism and Gandhism for the cities. So there's different ways in which this interpretation comes about. I'd recommend you read the book.
Yes, it's a very good book. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Venu. I have a couple comments and a question. Well, my first comment has to do with, thank you so much for bringing John Doob and the Olange, I guess, complex, because I was actually thinking of Rebecca's fantastic presentation from yesterday, and actually the idea of the constellation. So to think about Phoenix and Ulanje as part of a constellation or a cluster. I would love to get Rebecca's take on that. But really, I had not thought about the shoemaking part of it at all. And I need to go back, as you know, I've been obsessing about Gandhi and shoes and making of sandals and all that in my own work. And the fact that he might have actually been inspired to turn to shoemaking, because, it happens around 1904, 1905. I think this was 1901. So thank you for that. Second, a very strong suggestion, really a strong recommendation. Please don't show those colorized photographs of Gandhi.
Oh, yeah.
Nobody should. I mean, this is from Peter Rue's disastrous projects
I know.
by the Modi government and all. I mean, they are not. I mean, to my knowledge, there's only one color photograph of Gandhi, which a French photojournalist took. So we should not, I think the whole project is so, open to questioning at so many levels. But my question really has to do with this fantastic argument you're developing, so many levels, right? But I'm just going to go at one point of it, which is that Gandhi's ashrams were not just occupied by Gandhi and his body. There were other bodies.
Absolutely.
Human and non-human.
Absolutely.
How do we want to think about those other bodies? In fact, even when he is off, the ashrams remain this hub of activity. Even after he abandoned Sabarmati, as you know, famously, when he set out on the Salt March, that ashram never closes. He never goes back to it, right? But I'm particularly interested in the fact, of his ideas about, all these animals that, goats and cows and, the ways in which he thought about the human and non-human in these spaces.
Absolutely.
So how do we want to think about these other bodies in
It's right
in
here,
space?
actually. That's what you call the existential threshold. It's very low. So we're actually, I was actually working in Vardhana, going and visiting. There's another ashram, the Pavnar ashram. So you actually have like low doors, right? And so literally like there's doors for dogs. The windowsill level is really low. Of course, it's more to do with the way in which we sit on the floor. But the point being that it's a little closer to the earth, right? And so the nature of what gets in is fundamentally different from something which is a much higher sill level. I mean, just purely as an architectural thing I'm saying, but of course I'm sure there's other ways, and there's a lot of animals that keep roaming around here. There's a famous band of langurs. I've chanced upon them quite a few times, in various locations. So there's like that life continues. There's a lot of people this space actually, it's shared with. In terms of like a consistent idea, I mean, there's a snake, there's a small place where they would keep snakes also behind. And Madeline Slade is somebody who actually has a small stable for her horse. She used to ride by horse from her hut to meet Gandhi. So she'd be dressed in white and she'd be on a white horse. I don't know what was going on, but anyway, So that was like, those kinds of things are there. And it's mostly because of Madeline Slade, because I think she was very close to animals. And I think that's something that Gandhi, in my understanding, at least in Sevagram, he evolves, in that direction. His critique of vivisection, all of that is also happening over here. I don't know. It'll take me some.
There's so many children wandering about.
Yeah.
In spaces for children to sleep and. So it's, I'm wondering, in other words, thinking about Gandhi, the question is very, I think, basic, whether we want to just think about this as Gandhi's space alone.
Yeah.
And he's just one, among many other bodies, right?
Absolutely.
So really wondering about...
It's with Nai Talim that comes up. So the Nai Talim Center is right next door, right? So that is a whole different story.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That, right?
There's Marjorie Sykes and all,
Yeah. So in a way, it's another way of decentering Gandhi from these kind of Gandhian projects. There's
Absolutely.
Other, contributors to all these, spaces, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I have three. Thank you.
Just a real quick question. Thank you so much for such an enlightening presentation with all of these great arguments. I was just wondering, the whole concept of aparigraha, or like removing yourself from worldly things, and the concept of the Akash that he wrote, it sort of also decenters the body in a way, right? So I was just wondering, in your argument, when you center the body, how does that whole concept work?
Actually, the answer is right there in that text itself, actually. He actually decenters the body also, because that's like the portion where he's saying, I'll just read out that section, where he says, So this train of thought taken to the extreme leads us to the condition where even the body becomes an obstacle separating man again from the infinite. To understand this truth is to become indifferent to the dissolution of the body, for to lose oneself in the infinite is to find oneself. So I think like there's these kind of this velocity of these like negations. There's no end to it in his writing. So I think he's consistent to that extent. But there's just a sneaking sense that there is also this sense of narcissism somewhere when it talks about the body. This is just, yeah.
But you also talked about reducing himself to zero, which is aparigraha, but you also talked about his body being his last possession, and the struggles with getting rid of this last possession, right? So he recognizes that the body is both his weapon and his enemy, right? And George was both begins with a fantastic quote about how he needs the body, but it's the body which is
also the mine of dirt and all of that, yeah.
Right? That's what makes his ideas about the body so fascinating. He recognizes the contradiction and the complexities of what he's trying to do. So it is interesting that Akash is limitless, infinite, that the infinite actually goes with this fantastic arguments about zero,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
nothingness, shunyata,
Yeah.
right? So thank you for putting up this quote because it's making me think about that. Sorry, I'm interrupting.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for that fascinating talk. It really raises a lot of interesting sort of issues on how Gandhi is dealt with in this day. I'm curious about you are saying that architecture has been weakened, but I'm also curious in some aspects of Gandhi where architecture seems to play somewhat of a central role, particularly his interest with sanitation and the constant construction of toilets. And so how is that kind of like, what are your thoughts on where, here he's saying that architecture is going to create dust, bacteria, insects, etc. But then he's also at the same time engaged quite consciously in the construction of sanitary system, where that is pretty central to what he thinks about a healthy lifestyle should be. So I'm curious how
That's a good point.
that could be
I agree.
reconciled.
But again, the question of health is a means towards somehow, the idea of sanitation is also tied in with purging oneself in some ways of whatever, and to that extent, I think that's a road also that ultimately leads to this form of thinking. But it is true. I think that, like, the first thing that I saw when I actually went to Sevagram in 2003-4, just like, were like Apasai, Patwardhan, like this whole experiments with toilets over there. So that continues apace. I don't know if now, lately, I haven't been since the pandemic. So, I mean, that is certainly a concern. And Wardha is also the place where they developed the Sopa Sandas. So all of these experiments with like, toilets in the present. So, I mean, again, there's a Center of Science for Villages that comes up in the 1970s. And they are experimenting with sanitation and they are very much followers of Kumarappa. And so that continues. So you're certainly right. But I do think that's, in Wardha in particular, it's a post-independence phenomenon. He's talking about sanitation, but I haven't seen evidence of the constructed nature of toilets from that point in time. So perhaps they were, but that's something.
What was that?
Possible.
Interesting question.
Venu, I love your work, so thank you again for presenting it. I have two questions. One is that for him, the body is so instrumentalized. It's sort of the ground of a kind of crazy empiricism.
Yeah.
And it's a very tense relationship because the body is scrutinized and manipulated to such an intense degree that it has no, in a sense, autonomy of its own. So it ties in some level to that point you made at the end about narcissism. So then the second point I wanted to make was that Lakshmi Subramaniam's work, Singing Gandhi's India, she makes this really beautiful point, which might be useful for you as well because of architecture, where she says he didn't care about music. He doesn't care about good singing. And R.K. Narayan gets it really right in Waiting for the Mahatma, when his main female protagonist criticizes this aspiring Gandhian for wanting to make perfectly woven fabric. And she says, that's just for people who are those kind of people. What you want is functionalist stuff, like, 120 count or 140 count, not 200 count thread. So I think that it would be really interesting to understand his relationship to architecture, to his relationship to anything that's made, whether it is the sonic or the woven thing, whatever it is. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say. I think her work is pretty important in pointing out that he just didn't care about music beyond a point. It served a purpose, and then that was it.
No, I think like there's also this sense of the moment we actually talk about like this economizing or withdrawal from surpluses of any kind. That's a part of the Gandhian discourse, but there's also the question of varnashrama dharma that comes in there, which is this idea of sacrifice, right? That it's not just an empty letting go. That in the letting go you gain power, right? It is in letting go that you assert authority. There is that sense in which, and I think that's what the book at least tries to bring up in the second chapter, which is that this idea of the Kshatriya dharma of renunciation, of letting go, which is valor, which is also, possibly, it's possible that you harm yourself in the process. So I at least would not see parsimony or withdrawal from pleasure as being simply indifference. There would always, at least in this time period, especially because it's the time when he's engaging with Dr. Ambedkar. And Dr. Ambedkar, 1936 is when he actually, gets the Jatpat Todak Mandal speech printed, right? So these huts are constructed almost concurrently. So I was kind of trying to, I felt that is the larger world to which these huts belong, this conversation. And you can't, I think, in my personal opinion, but I'm sure other opinions are there, you can't remove this architecture from that broader debate on caste. But whether that bears out in other people's writing, I think they'll have to tell me. I'll know when I hear from others. Yeah.
I have one question, which I'm trying to formulate. Which has to do with time, which I know you talk about in your book. But it occurred to me that your example, where you start with Akash in the prison, which is also a palace, where he realizes that he has time to look at the sky, and it's time that affords him that engagement. And then your last comment about the letter to the worker, where it's about, in some ways, the text seems to be about the space where he can't leave his home. He's always working. There's not that luxury of being able to leave the home, but it's actually also about a luxury of time that is lacking, right? Yeah. And so I guess I wanted to think about, you did a beautiful job of sort of weaving together these internal contradictions in his thought, and it seemed like time was basically this other internal contradiction that without that relation to temporality and the sort of enabling of a period of time, one couldn't have this health that he was going for, right? And so that interrelation between the openness of the architecture and this openness of time also, it seemed to me, had a lovely
surplus of time.
Yeah.
You have that in jail, so, then you kind of like enjoy. But I think like in the other sense, like also that, it's like Satyagraha is not about surpluses. It's all about living in where there is no surplus available of time or resources, right? So I think that contradiction is there in his own writing, but he's also not entirely insensitive towards it. That's what
because he's so parsimonious about time, right? I mean, he's so fixated on time. I mean, the last thing before he was shot, was the fact that he was late, right? He was not on time, right? So he had a real, again, contradictory idea. It wasn't, infinite time he realized was both finite but also both infinite but also finite. He was such a time-conscious guy.
Yeah.
He had that watch, he was obsessing about looking at the clock all the time.
That's right. Yeah. Any other questions? If not, then we can leave it at the surplus of time. So
I wanted to know, what did you think about the constellation? Your argument about constellation in terms of being this fantastic presentation. How would that come in? What would be the other constellations that we could bring in conversation with some of these
Yeah.
ideas, some of the ideas of these particular kinds of buildings, you know. I was thinking of the peasant's hut, right?
Yeah.
You know, maybe from Sevagram, right? Varga. Wonder if that would be, you know, something helpful.
Well, I love the connection you were trying to redraw, that you had sort of resisted, saying you weren't sure whether the South African neighbors had interacted. But I think I think that might be a resonance, right, if they're not actually connecting. But I also think there's, for me, the other resonance with Akash is Charles Correa,
Yeah, yeah. Open to sky.
which is the open to sky thing. And that's a very different relation to sky, but it really struck me, especially since then he goes on to build the Gandhi ashram with that in mind. It's just one other. So there's there's a thread there, and I read Correa's open to sky as a very almost Orientalist, ahistorical engagement with the sort of, in Asia we are open to this, you know. But I think there's there's an interesting connection here, because this is also very ahistorical, very universalist in its relation, the connection with the sky, transcendence, etc. See, I'm getting a refill. Okay. So that was another potential constellational connection here that might illuminate some of the things that Gandhi is trying to do or not trying to do. I don't know what you think.
No, I think to add to that about shoes, I forgot. Laurie Baker, when he met Gandhi, Gandhi wanted to talk to Laurie Baker because he wanted to learn from Laurie Baker how he made his shoes. That's what the report is. I mean,
From Laurie Baker.
Yeah. So he was interested in, because Laurie Baker was making his own shoes. In 1943, he comes to Bombay because he's going off back to England from China, and that's where he meets Gandhi in this group of Quaker associates. And that's when Baker Gandhi takes interest in Baker because he wanted to learn from him how to make his shoes.
But he's already making shoes for 3 decades.
That's what I'm saying. So maybe Baker was making more interesting shoes.
Obsessed with shoes, you know, which is fascinating, and leather, which is also fascinating, right, in terms of caste politics. Yeah.
Well, I was going to suggest that we have about 10 minutes before we officially have to start our next talk. So I thought maybe it would be nice for us to all get up, have a little, stretch, use the facilities, and reconvene at 11:45. So it's 10 minutes. But first, let us thank Venu for this wonderful.